When the emergency services in Tallinn received the call from Anna Valgu, she first apologized for the early disturbance and only then calmly reported that her son, Rasmus, had fallen onto an old stove in the basement and had been unconscious for some time. The woman's voice sounded even and everyday, as if it were a small domestic inconvenience and not a serious incident. A few minutes later, the team of paramedics was already standing in front of the Valgu family's house in the quiet suburb of Viimsi. Anna, as if nothing had happened, showed the doctors the way to the second floor, to the bedroom. According to her, Rasmus was taken there after the fall so that he would be more comfortable. It took paramedic Rego Kaljuste just one glance to understand. Anna's words did not correspond to what he saw in the room. Rasmus's condition was serious and looked completely different from accidental household injuries. Traces of symmetrical burns were visible on his body, too clear and even to have been caused by a fall. His clothes were dirty, which contrasted strangely with the clean bed and tidy room. Extreme exhaustion and traces of prolonged dehydration were also evident. Without losing any more words, the paramedic contacted the control center and called the police to the scene with a special code indicating suspicious circumstances. The officers who arrived at the scene quickly understood that the parents' explanations raised questions. Anna and her husband Marcus repeated the same thing, clear, confident, as if they had memorized the words. Their statements seemed too well rehearsed to be coincidental. In the meantime, the doctors at the North Estonian Regional Hospital confirmed the paramedics' conclusions. Rasmus's injuries could in no way be the result of a simple accident. From that moment on, the police initiated a comprehensive investigation without realizing how complicated the truth would be. The police officers entered the Valgu family's house already knowing that the medics doubted the parents' version. The ambulance had already left with Rasmus by then, and now the officers had to clarify the matter on site. Anna and Marcus appeared completely calm. They immediately led the police into the kitchen, offered them to sit down, but the officers declined. The conversation began without introductions or formalities. Anna was the first to repeat her story. Her voice sounded even and clear, as if she were narrating a familiar scenario. According to her, they heard a noise in the basement in the morning, went downstairs, and saw that Rasmus was lying unconscious next to the old stove. Marcus nodded silently, confirming his wife's words. In their narrative, there were no deviations, no hesitation, no contradictions. It sounded credible, too credible. The police officers were surprised by the family's calmness. They noticed how perfect the house looked. Everything was clean, tidy, furniture and objects in their place. An ordinary, even boringly prosperous household. Family photos on the walls, happy parents, and a smiling Rasmus. Nothing in the house indicated any problems or conflicts. In the meantime, neighbors had gathered outside. In small settlements, such incidents quickly attract attention, so the officers decided to speak with them as well. The neighbors told roughly the same story. The Valgu family always seemed quiet and withdrawn. No one had noticed scandals or strange behavior. They almost never received guests, lived reclusively. But that didn't particularly worry anyone. Who knows how someone wants to live? The police officers returned to the house and asked Marcus to show them the basement. He agreed without batting an eye and led them down the stairs. Anna remained upstairs and didn't even offer to go down with them. That also seemed strange, although it contradicted neither the law nor logic. As the officers descended into the basement, they immediately noticed a musty smell. It was cool and gloomy downstairs, but everything looked surprisingly tidy. A layer of dust lay on the old furniture and boxes. Obviously, no one had touched anything in the basement for a long time. Finally, Marcus pointed to the stove. It stood in the furthest corner, surrounded by old junk. He said again confidently that Rasmus had fallen right there. One of the officers stepped closer and examined the stove carefully. Then he touched it with his hand. The metal was cold, covered with a thick layer of old dust. It was obvious that the stove had not been fired for a very long time. It certainly could not have been the cause of Rasmus's burns, which the parents spoke of so confidently. The police officers looked at each other in silence. They realized the Valgu family was not telling the truth. The officer went upstairs and briefly informed Anna and Marcus that their statements did not match what they had found in the basement. The parents calmly took note of this finding and said nothing, just looked at each other. A short but important sentence was noted in the police report. The parents' statements do not match the situation at the crime scene. The officers already understood that the case went far beyond a common household accident. Now they intended to check every corner of the house, every object, and every detail to understand what Anna and Marcus Valgu were trying to distract from. That same evening, the official medical report from the North Estonian Regional Hospital arrived at the police station. The document, signed by the chief physician, removed all doubts. Until then, the officers could only suspect that Anna and Marcus's story did not match the facts. Now they had proof. The report stated in black and white, the nature of the burns on Rasmus's body did not correspond to a single contact with a hot surface. The traces indicated prolonged and repeated exposure to high temperatures. In addition, signs of severe exhaustion and dehydration were found, conditions that develop not in hours, but in days. The doctor also noted the absence of characteristic injuries that occurred during a fall. All of this ruled out an accident. The police received the document during the night. The duty investigator carefully read each paragraph and ordered the materials to be forwarded to the public prosecutor's office. The officer's report, who had inspected the basement, was attached to the case, noting, "The stove is cold, covered with dust, and has not been used for a long time." Two independent sources, the medical report and the inspection report, completely destroyed the family's version. The next morning, police officers came to the Valguses' house again. Anna and Marcus were invited to the station for official questioning. Formally, they had not yet been arrested, but their status as witnesses did not last long. After a meeting with the public prosecutor, it was decided to initiate criminal proceedings for serious bodily harm to a person under their care. From that moment on, Anna and Marcus Valgu were no longer just worried parents. They were defendants in a criminal case. The house was sealed, preparations for a search began. The investigators were granted the right to seize all items that could be related to the incident. Rasmus remained in intensive care at this time. His condition was described by the doctors as stable but serious. The police posted a guard outside the room, waiting for an opportunity to take a statement from him. For the Valgu family, a new stage began. Nothing remained of the attempt to maintain the appearance of a normal life. The version of an accident had collapsed, and now the investigation had to find out where and under what circumstances Rasmus had suffered these burns, and why the house, where order and cleanliness reigned, hid such a cruel secret. In the evening of the same day, the official medical report from the North Estonian Regional Hospital arrived at the police. The chief physician confirmed the policeman's suspicions and stated in the report that the nature of the burns on Rasmus' body did not correspond to a single contact with a hot object. The injuries were obviously caused by prolonged and repeated exposure to high temperatures. In addition, signs of severe exhaustion and prolonged dehydration were found, which could not have developed in a short time. The doctor separately emphasized the absence of injuries typical of a fall, which further contradicted Anna and Marcus's version. The report was delivered to the police around 10 o'clock in the evening. The investigator again checked every detail of the report and immediately forwarded the materials to the public prosecutor's office. The medical document was also accompanied by the protocol of the basement inspection, in which it was separately noted that the stove was covered with a layer of dust and obviously had not been used recently. These two details completely contradicted the parents' statements. Early the next morning, the police officers drove to the Valgu family again. Anna and Marcus were asked to come to the station and answer questions. Initially, they testified as witnesses, but after a few hours, their status changed. After reviewing all the materials, the public prosecutor's office gave instructions to initiate criminal proceedings for grievous bodily harm to a person under their care. Now the police no longer regarded Anna and Marcus as just parents, but as suspects. Their house was sealed for a further search. The investigators received permission to confiscate all objects that could explain what exactly had happened to Rasmus. Rasmus himself remained in intensive care. The doctors noted a serious condition with no significant improvement. A police officer stood guard outside the room, waiting for the moment when it would be possible to speak with him personally. For the Valgu family, the situation had radically changed. The familiar world of calm and order had disappeared. The version that Anna and Marcus tried to present to the police turned out to be completely refuted. Now, it was up to the investigators to find out what was really hidden behind the cleanliness and outward appearance of their house. When the police officers went down to the basement a second time, they noticed something they had overlooked during the first inspection. In the furthest corner of the room, behind tall shelves with boxes and tools, stood an unusual object. It was a wooden box, obviously handmade and hastily crafted. It looked absolutely new and fresh, in contrast to the dusty and long, unused basement. The investigators carefully examined the find. The dimensions of the box immediately seemed strange. 120 centimeters long and only 50 centimeters high and wide. It was unclear what such a construction was even needed for. Its lid was secured with massive metal clasps, and inside it was completely empty. The smell of freshly cut cedar wood still filled the room. The investigator decided to ask Marcus a direct question about the purpose of the box. Marcus, maintaining his outward calm, replied that he had simply wanted to make a box for storing old things and tools. But this explanation seemed absurd. The box was too narrow and impractical for these purposes, and it was in too inconvenient a location. Furthermore, Marcus could not explain why he had made it from expensive cedar wood and not from the usual materials that were lying directly in the basement. The police officers continued the inspection and called in forensic technicians to secure and confiscate the object as possible evidence. When the forensic technicians examined the find more closely, they found barely visible fabric fibers inside. An expert immediately suspected that it could be clothing material. Later, a laboratory analysis confirmed that the fabric completely matched the clothing in which Rasmus had been brought to the hospital. An even more important find was biological traces discovered on the inner surface of the box. This evidence meant that someone had obviously been inside for a long time and not of their own free will. The laboratory confirmed that these traces belonged to Rasmus himself. At this moment, the investigators understood that the strange wooden box was not just a useless piece of furniture. It was the main key to understanding what was really happening in the Valgu house. The box was officially recognized as evidence that could shed light on the actual events of the last days and hours before the emergency call. The police officers included the find in the official report and sent it to the Forensic Science Center for detailed investigation. Already in the next few hours, experts would be involved in the case who had to find out exactly what this strange object was built for and what role the parents themselves played in it. When Anna and Marcus were informed that an object related to Rasmus had been found in their basement, they did not appear surprised. On the contrary, both reacted too reservedly, as if they had known in advance that this would happen. The investigator carefully observed every movement, how they looked at each other before answering, how they chose their words. The atmosphere in the interrogation room resembled a silent game where every phrase could be a mistake. When it came to the found cedar wood box, Marcus explained that it was a misunderstanding. He said that the box had indeed been in the basement, but it was by no means made for what the investigators thought. He repeated the earlier explanation, supposedly for storing old things. The investigator did not argue. He merely placed photos on the table, close-ups of the inner surface of the box and the expert's report. After a short pause, Anna tried to intervene, saying that this was all a mistake and that the true cause of Rasmus's injuries lay elsewhere entirely. They mentioned a third person for the first time. According to the parents, their family had long-standing conflicts with the school psychologist. This psychologist, according to their words, had insisted on medical treatment, threatened to inform Child Protective Services, and often made sharp comments about how Anna and Marcus were raising their son. Anna said that Rasmus started to behave strangely, becoming withdrawn and anxious, precisely after the last conversation with him. This sounded like an attempt to build a new line of defense, to divert the investigators' attention from the family to an external specialist. The investigators understood that the version seemed far-fetched, but they were nevertheless obliged to check it. A case of bodily harm required checking every detail, especially when a person with a professional relationship to Rasmus was mentioned. School records indeed contained notes that the psychologist had recommended the Valgus seek medical help and undergo an additional examination. His signature was under the school board's report, which stated that Rasmus's behavior was unstable and required control. The parents did not sign this document and soon after broke contact with the educational institution. The psychologist was summoned for questioning the very next day. Formally, he was considered a witness, but the investigators regarded him as a person of operational interest. It had to be clarified whether he had a personal conflict with the Valgu family and whether he could actually be involved in what had happened. Thus, the first person outside the family appeared in the case, a figure on whom the entire attention of the investigators focused for a while. While the investigators were examining the version about the school psychologist, the financial department of the police conducted a standard check of the Valgu family. Such inquiries are always made automatically, to understand whether the incident is related to debts, extortion, or external interference. Normally, such checks yield nothing, but in this case, everything was different. A bank statement that arrived a few days later changed the course of the investigation. Regular transfers to large organizations were found on the Valgu family's accounts, which were not listed in their declarations or in the expenses they spoke of. 5 transactions in the last 3 months, the total sum, a little more than 5,000 euros. The recipient, an account with a name that none of the investigators had heard before. Children of the Sun. The name sounded strange. In Estonia, there were no registered foundations, public movements, or legal companies with this name. The investigator immediately requested additional information from the bank service and received confirmation. The money actually went to a private account registered to a natural person named Alar Veski. Further checks revealed that the transfers were made manually, not through automatic payments but via online banking with Anna Valgu's personal access. One of the transfers was marked Consultation on Cleaning Method. This was the first documentary evidence that the family was involved in something larger than just a family conflict or stress. When the investigators compared the transfer data with the events, it became clear that they coincided with the key moments of Rasmus's worsening condition. The first payment, 1 week before the neighbors stopped seeing him in the yard. The second, after the parents stopped taking him to school. The last, 1 day before the emergency call. At this moment, the investigators' attention shifted from the psychologist to the mysterious organization. What were these Children of the Sun, and why was the family transferring money there? Why were there traces of participation in an esoteric system in the house where a strange cedarwood box was found? The investigator ordered data on Alar Veski, the account holder, to be requested. An initial check showed that he was listed as the head of a private spiritual center that conducted meetings and purification rituals in a rented room on the outskirts of Tallinn. His name had already appeared in archive reports as the organizer of dubious seminars related to alternative therapy. Now, the police had a new direction of work. The Valgu family, who had tried to portray themselves as ordinary and prosperous, was connected to a religious group whose existence no one in the village had even heard of. The operational group prepared a request for the seizure of documents from the Children of the Sun office. And very soon, this check would provide the first name that was to become the key to the solution. The leader, Alar. When the investigator summoned Anna and Marcus for questioning again, he immediately asked about the transfers to the Children of the Sun organization's account. The parents' reaction was unexpected even for experienced police officers. Instead of explaining these payments in some way, both remained silent, as if this question had completely surprised them. Anna looked uncertainly at her husband, but Marcus avoided looking her in the eyes and instead stared somewhere at the wall. After a long pause, the investigator repeated the question and showed them the bank statements. Marcus continued to remain silent, clenching his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Anna quietly replied that they had paid the money for spiritual help. Her voice sounded confused and unconvincing, as if she herself did not believe what she was saying. The investigator asked for a more precise explanation of what this phrase meant, but Anna did not elaborate, only repeating, "It was spiritual help, nothing more." The investigator noticed that the couple's behavior had changed drastically. While they had tried to appear calm and confident in the first days, they now seemed withdrawn and tense, without revealing details of their relationship with the organization. It was particularly disturbing that they categorically denied that this money was intended for any treatment of Rasmus. This was especially strange, considering that it was a sum equivalent to their monthly income. The police officers understood. The less Anna and Marcus spoke about the Children of the Sun, the more questions arose about the organization itself. Their silence seemed like an attempt to protect not only themselves, but also the person behind the mysterious group. When the investigator mentioned the name Alar Veski again, the parents again fell silent and became even more tense. It was obvious that this name was familiar to them, and that it evoked special emotions in them. After the interrogation, the investigators decided to compare the statements of Anna and Marcus. Small but important discrepancies were found in their words. Anna claimed that they had only recently met the organization, literally a few months ago, and that she did not remember the details of the meetings. Marcus, on the other hand, stated that he had known about Vesky's teachings for a long time, and that the organization had really helped them. These contradictions showed that the couple had not agreed in advance on which version they would give to the investigation. Their lack of cooperation not only strengthened the investigators' suspicions, but also led to a new phase of the investigation. Now, the police had to understand why the parents, who initially seemed only confused, remained so stubbornly silent about their connection to the children of the sun. Obviously, the organization was hiding something much more significant than just spiritual help. The investigators began to prepare for a conversation with the person who could shed much more light on the situation than Anna and Marcus. This person was Aller Vesky, whose name had already been mentioned several times during the investigation. The name Aller Vesky first appeared in the files a few days after the analysis of bank transfers. At first glance, he seemed like another esoteric consultant, a man who promised spiritual enlightenment for money. But the deeper the investigators delved into his activities, the less it resembled harmless lectures on inner balance. According to the documents, Vesky was the head of a center called Children of the Sun. In reality, it was a closed group that one could only join by personal invitation. Formerly, their meetings were called Sessions for Energetic Harmonization, but former participants said that everything that happened there resembled rituals with elements of strict discipline and subordination to the leader. Vesky had a special way of speaking that his followers called the voice of the leader. He claimed he could cleanse people of inner darkness and lead them to the light of the sun. The investigators requested data on Vesky's phone movements from mobile phone providers. The results were unexpected. His mobile phone was located several times in the zone of base stations near the village of VMC. The first signal was registered at the end of August 2005. The second on the 9th of September, and the last on the 13th of September, one day before Rasmus was admitted to the hospital. All these signals were tied to the same location, the area where the Valgu family's house was located. For the investigators, this became a turning point. Until then, the police had no direct evidence that someone from outside had visited the house before the incident. Now, technical data connected a specific person to the scene of the events on critical dates. After that, Vesky went from a common figure in the reports to a key figure in the investigation. His photos were added to the files, and his contacts were included in the list of the Valgu family's connections. The police found several witness statements that Anna had attended Children of the Sun meetings in Tallinn a few weeks before the tragedy, and one of the neighbors had seen a dark car, similar to the one Olar used near the house in early September. The coincidences became too precise to ignore. The investigators no longer doubted. The man who called himself a leader was directly related to what happened in the Valgu family. Soon a request for his interrogation was made, and the police began to prepare for a meeting with the man who, in the investigators' opinion, could not only be a spiritual mentor, but the one who guided Anna and Marcus's actions step by step. When the results of the cedar wood box examination finally arrived at the department, the investigators understood. The mysterious object could no longer be considered a mere piece of furniture. It became the central piece of evidence in the Valgu family case. The forensic technician's report was detailed, precise, and ruled out any speculation. The first thing the experts noted was the presence of biological traces. Tissue particles, microscopic traces of sweat, and epithelium matching Rasmus's DNA were found on the inner surface of the box. The laboratory confirmed the match on all key markers. The traces could not have gotten there by chance. Their density and arrangement indicated that a person had been inside it for a prolonged period. The second examination concerned fingerprints. Traces from 3 people were found on the lid of the box and the metal fasteners: Anna Valgu, her husband Marcus, and Aller Vesky. The investigators knew that the prints could have been left during normal contact, but the experts clarified. The arrangement of the prints and the direction of pressure indicated that the lid was closed by at least 2 people and held from above. This was no longer a coincidence, but an action that required effort and coordination. The third part of the report concerned the wood itself. The surface of the cedar wood, particularly in the lower part of the structure, showed signs of heating. A microscopic analysis revealed that the fiber structure was partially deformed by exposure to high temperatures. Ash and soot particles were found on the outer walls, traces indicating that heat sources were present around the box. Judging by the nature of the traces, the heating was not instantaneous but prolonged and even. These three facts, biological traces, fingerprints, and heat marks, formed a clear picture. For the first time throughout the entire investigation, the inquiry had a verifiable connection between Rasmus, his parents, and Olorveski. Everything indicated that this box was not a random construction, but the central element of the actions that took place in the basement of the Valgu house. The investigator studying the report briefly noted in the record, physical connection of those involved established, accidental version ruled out. Now the police could build the chronology of events not based on the parents' words, but on facts, and all of them led to one person, the one who called himself a leader and assured his followers that he could cleanse souls. The investigators understood. Before them was a conversation that would decide the fate of the entire case. Olorveski had to provide explanations. The parents' version of the school psychologist's involvement in the events in the Valgu family seemed doubtful from the start, but formally, the investigators were obliged to check it. They understood that Anna and Marcus might be trying to divert suspicion, but as long as they had no official confirmations, the version remained. The check began with the interrogation of the psychologist himself. He immediately agreed to cooperate, provided all necessary information to the investigation, and voluntarily handed over his phone records and documents. His narrative proved to be consistent and convincing. The psychologist insisted on medical help for Rasmus solely within the scope of his professional duties and never had personal conflicts with the parents. He admitted that his recommendations did indeed cause irritation in Anna and Marcus, but this could by no means be the reason for what happened in the Valgu house. Next, the police carefully checked his alibi. There were even more confirmations than necessary to clear him of suspicion. In the period from the 12th to the 14th of September, when the main events in the Valgu family took place, the psychologist was in Tartu at a professional conference. He provided the investigators with train tickets, hotel bills, bank statements confirming expenses in cafes and shops, and official certificates proving his participation in the conference events. In addition to the documents, the psychologist's alibis was also confirmed by his colleagues who were with him at the same conference. They described his behavior in detail, noting that they had not noticed anything unusual or suspicious during those days. The investigators even obtained surveillance camera footage from the hotel that fully corroborated his words. Thus, all doubts about the psychologist's involvement were dispelled. The version that Anna and Marcus tried to force had finally collapsed. It now became obvious that the parents were deliberately trying to mislead the investigators and put them on a false trail. This only worsened their situation. After this version was closed, only 3 people remained in the police's sights: Anna, Marcus, and Olorveski. No one else from the family circle had even indirect confirmations of their involvement. It was now absolutely clear to the investigators that the responsibility for what happened lay solely with the parents and the leader of the group who called himself a guide. All the investigators' efforts were now directed at clarifying Olorveski's role and what precise influence he exerted on the parents. His interrogation was to be the next stage of the investigation, capable of finally uncovering the picture of what happened in the quiet house on the outskirts of Viimsi. When the investigators began to check Olorveski's identity, it very quickly became clear that they were dealing with a person with a completely different biography than the one he presented to his followers. The suspect's real name, Andris Kask, 45 years old, had previously repeatedly appeared in police reports for fraud. All episodes were similar: promises to improve health, fix problems in personal life, and so on, all for considerable sums of money. The first case against him appeared as early as the late 90s. At that time, Kask organized a small center for alternative therapy, where clients were offered purification sessions and various types of energetic influence for a fee. At first, people came voluntarily and paid relatively small amounts. But after some time, he began to intimidate clients, telling them that their problems would return without additional procedures and would become even worse. Finally, one of the victims filed a complaint, but at that time, the investigators' evidence was not enough to bring the case to court. Andras Kask escaped punishment and disappeared from the view of law enforcement for several years. He returned as Aller Veski and quickly founded a group called Children of the Sun. This was now no longer a small esoteric group, but a closed organization, which one could only join after a personal interview with Veski himself. There, he presented himself as a kind of spiritual guide, claiming he could purify people's consciousness and solve their internal problems. Over time, strict rules emerged in the group. Participants said that they had to report to Veski about every action, explain all personal decisions, and even break contact with friends and relatives if he demanded it. The police found several former members of the group who described in detail exactly how Veski operated. First, he simply conducted group sessions and seminars, saying that he could help people free themselves from inner darkness. But then he offered individual sessions for a separate fee, where he convinced clients that they had very serious problems that could only be solved through expensive procedures. Some followers of the group confessed that they gave him practically all their savings. Veski had neither medical nor psychological training, and all his methods were based exclusively on his own fantasies and skillful manipulation of gullible people. He did not use physical violence, but exerted such pressure on his followers that they gradually began to fully submit to his will and give him any money. The investigators also examined the materials they had seized from his office. Among the papers were notes in which Veski described rituals related to the effects of heat and warmth on the body in detail. These records were very similar to what Anna Valgu described in her diaries when she spoke of the purification procedure they performed at home with Rasmus. Thus, the police received final confirmation of Veski's motive: money and power over people. It was a classic fraud that, in this case, led to severe consequences. Now the investigators only needed to obtain the parents' statements to find out how exactly Aller Veski's methods led to the tragedy in the Valgu house. Anna and Marcus Valgu were once again at the police station. By this time, the investigation had enough evidence to speak to them differently, not as witnesses, but as those who were clearly hiding something. The investigator decided to use this meeting for a final conversation, in which the suspects would no longer be able to evade answering. The interrogation began calmly. The parents were presented one by one and without further comment with all the collected evidence. On the table before them appeared photographs and the results of the examination of that wooden box from the basement of their house. Anna looked at the pictures for only a few seconds, then lowered her gaze. Marcus remained unmoved, as if he was not taking what was happening seriously. The investigator continued. Next, he showed excerpts from the Valgu family's bank accounts, which recorded large sums sent to Veski's organization. He explained that the police already knew exactly how Alar was connected to them and what role this money played. Marcus again did not react. Anna became nervous. Her breathing quickened. She nervously clenched and unclenched her hands, but still said nothing. After that, they were presented with documents containing data on phone connections. The papers clearly indicated the dates and times of Aller Veski's presence in the immediate vicinity of their house. The investigator calmly explained that all their words about the lack of a connection to Veski were now refuted by irrefutable evidence. Marcus said not a word, only interlaced his fingers and stared intently straight ahead. Anna gradually began to lose self-control. Her eyes gleamed with tears. She bit her lips, trying to hold back her emotions. The investigator paused briefly to allow Anna and Marcus to comprehend their situation. Then he said that both of them were now in an equally difficult situation, and the question was which of them was willing to be the first to tell exactly how Aller Veski influenced their decisions and actions. After these words, Anna burst into tears. She asked for the interrogation to be stopped and for a lawyer to be called. Marcus turned sharply to her, and for the first time during the entire period, tried to catch her gaze, but Anna avoided looking in his direction. She repeated her request to the investigator once more and added that she was ready to tell everything, but only if Marcus was not present. She could no longer hide the truth. This was the moment when a complete break occurred between the spouses. Marcus was visibly stunned by her decision and, for the first time during the investigation, lost his composure. He stared at Anna for a few more seconds, as if hoping for her silence, but then he shut down again and turned away. The investigator agreed to Anna's conditions and arranged to organize a separate conversation with her and her lawyer. For the first time during the entire investigation, Anna was ready to tell everything that truly happened in her house and how Alar Vesky had managed to bring her family under his control. This confession was precisely what would finally uncover the true picture of events and close the case. When Anna Valgu finally decided to speak, she looked utterly defeated and exhausted. The lawyer repeatedly asked for water and gave her small breaks so she could compose herself. Finally, Anna began to give a confession, and every one of her words sounded so clear and convincing that the investigators no longer had any doubt about what had truly happened in the Valgu family's house. She recounted that Alar Vesky had gradually gained the family's full trust. At first, his words sounded harmless: advice, lectures, support. But then he began to say that Rasmus's behavior was connected to a dark energy that needed to be driven out of him. According to Anna, Vesky was so convincing that she and Marcus accepted his words as absolute truth and did not even think to question them. Further in the protocol appeared the crucial details. Alar Vesky personally suggested that they perform a special ritual that would supposedly free Rasmus from what he called a dark entity. He explained in detail how to build the wooden box and how to place heat sources around it. He warned that during the procedure, the box should not be opened and the process should not be interfered with. The parents should only observe. Anna confessed that she and her husband did everything according to Vesky's instructions. She also did not hide what happened next. According to her words, at some point, they realized that the situation was getting out of control, that everything had gone too far. However, Alar convinced them not to stop, saying that otherwise, everything they had done would have been in vain. He persistently repeated that, at the end of the ritual, everything would be fine, and Rasmus would become healthy and calm. Only when Rasmus stopped responding to their voices did the parents finally lose control and panic. Alar had disappeared from the house at that moment, leaving them alone with the consequences of what he had called purification. Marcus immediately decided to take his son to the hospital, understanding that further waiting was no longer possible. Anna finished her story without trying to justify herself or her husband. She was fully aware of the consequences of her actions, but repeatedly emphasized that all her actions were exclusively under the influence of Alar Vesky. It was his authority and pressure that led her to fully submit and no longer be able to distinguish between right and terrible and unacceptable. This confession became the decisive evidence that completely destroyed the false versions that the Valgu family initially tried to construct for the investigators. Now, the investigators had not only facts, but also comprehensive explanations for the motives and actions of everyone involved in this incident. The next step was obvious. The investigators had to speak directly with Alar Vesky and find out his own version of events. Alar Vesky's arrest proceeded calmly and without resistance. It seemed as if he was fully prepared for such a turn of events and did not even seem surprised when he was taken to the station. But during the confrontation with Anna Valgu, Vesky behaved in a completely unexpected way for everyone present. He not only refused to confirm her words, but also denied any responsibility for what had happened. When the investigator read Anna's confession to him, Alar calmly and confidently stated that all his advice was exclusively symbolic and metaphorical in nature. He claimed he had never told the parents to take real actions, and certainly had not forced them to do anything against their will. The money, according to his words, was also merely a voluntary donation that the Valgu family made out of gratitude and respect for his work. Anna listened to his words without raising her head. It was obvious that she was shocked and confused by his denial. Vesky spoke convincingly and obviously expected to persuade the investigators of his complete innocence. He insisted that the parents had misunderstood his words and actions and were now trying to shift responsibility for their own mistakes onto him. Despite this stance, the investigators already had a sufficient amount of evidence of his direct involvement. The expertise confirmed his presence at the scene. Bank statements and call records showed a direct connection between Vesky and the Valgu family. Anna's confessions became the key element of the indictment, and Vesky's refusal to acknowledge obvious facts could no longer change anything. The investigators were finally convinced of his character. A man accustomed to manipulating others, he continued to insist on his innocence even in the face of irrefutable evidence. Based on all the collected materials, the prosecutor's office gave instructions to officially indict Alar Vesky. Now, the investigation only had to prepare the case for submission to the court and prove that behind the calm face of the spiritual leader hid a man who was fully aware of the consequences of his actions. Based on Anna Valgu's testimony and the collected evidence, the investigators were able to reconstruct in detail the entire chronology of what happened in the Valgu house in September of that year. Anna recounted that Alar Veski personally came to their house on the evening of the 12th of September. By this time, the cedar wood box was already in the basement, built according to his plans. Alar checked the construction, carefully inspected every detail, then told the parents that the right moment for the ritual had come and asked them to prepare everything necessary. Anna emphasized that she and her husband carried out all instructions silently and without objection, in a state of complete conviction of the correctness of what was happening. When everything was ready, Alar ordered them to put Rasmus in the box and close the lid tightly. Marcus followed his command without question. Veski then placed stones heated in the fire around the box. He explained that these were precisely what should create the necessary atmosphere and burn out negative energy. Then Olar ordered the parents to stay in the basement and simply observe. He particularly emphasized that under no circumstances should they intervene, open the box, or interrupt the ritual. At first, Anna and Marcus sat motionless, watching as Olar regularly replaced the stones with fresh hot ones. The basement gradually filled with heat. It became difficult to breathe, but Olar was absolutely calm and continued to assure them that everything was going according to plan. Several times Anna asked if they could at least open the lid briefly to make sure everything was all right, but Veski sharply suppressed any attempt at doubt, saying that otherwise, everything done would be in vain. Gradually, time passed, and the parents began to feel more and more fear. Alar insisted on continuing the ritual without interruption. Even when Anna said she heard strange noises and felt that something was wrong, Veski sharply rebuked her, assuring her that any disturbances could interfere with the purification process. Anna emphasized that they were literally hypnotized by his confidence and authority, afraid to disobey, although both inwardly felt that all this was wrong. Almost one day passed. It became the 13th of September. Veski continued to replace the stones, ensuring that no one violated his instructions. The parents hardly slept and barely knew how much time had passed. Anna claimed that she and her husband at some point barely perceived reality and fully relied on Alar's words and instructions. On the morning of the 14th of September, Alar suddenly declared that the process was complete and quickly left the house, saying that they could now open the box. The parents immediately rushed to it. When Marcus lifted the lid, he realized that the situation was critical. Rasmus no longer responded to his voice, did not open his eyes, and did not move. Anna panicked, and Marcus, without waiting for advice, immediately carried Rasmus out of the basement and drove towards the hospital. Anna, meanwhile, called emergency services and calmly stated the prepared version they had previously agreed upon with Alar. She hoped that no one would question her explanations. Now the police fully understood the mechanism of what had happened. Anna and Marcus performed these actions under the strongest psychological pressure from Alar Veski. The investigators concluded that, although the parents bore direct responsibility for their actions, the decisive role lay with Veski, who skillfully directed their fears and despair. The case was fully ready for trial, where the fate of all those involved in these tragic events was to be finally decided. The court hearing in the case of the Valgu family and Alar Veski began in April 2006 in Tallinn. The trial was closed to the public, and journalists were not allowed into the courtroom given the complexity and nature of the case. The prosecutor briefly and factually read out the indictment. Veski was charged on several counts: fraud, manipulation, and grievous bodily harm. Anna and Marcus Valgu were listed as defendants for abandoning a person in a dangerous situation. In court, Anna again confirmed her confessions and recounted that she was completely under the influence of Alar Veski. Marcus spoke little, but also pleaded guilty, repeating that he had acted under pressure and fear of the mentor. Veski pleaded not guilty on all counts, claiming that his actions and advice were exclusively spiritual and symbolic in nature. However, the court found his explanations insufficient and incredible. When pronouncing the verdict, the court emphasized that Alar Veski had deliberately abused his influence and authority to mislead people and force them into dangerous actions. He was sentenced to 12 years of imprisonment in a general regime penal colony. Anna and Marcus Valgu received 3 years of probation from the court, with a probationary period and full deprivation of parental rights. The court took into account their cooperation with the investigators, as well as the fact that their actions were committed under strong psychological pressure from Vesky. After the verdict was pronounced, Oller Vesky calmly left the courtroom, accompanied by guards. Anna was in tears, and Marcus appeared distraught and confused. However, even after the court proceedings concluded, the question remained open as to how many other families might have been affected by the actions of the Children of the Sun group. The investigators were sure that the Valgu family was not the only one who had believed Vesky and suffered from his manipulations. After the trial, Rasmus underwent a long course of rehabilitation. He did not remember the terrible events and asked no questions, as if his consciousness simply refused to return to the past. The boy was handed over to a new family, where he received support and the opportunity to start anew. The Children of the Sun organization ceased to exist immediately after Oller Vesky's arrest. This case became an important signal for law enforcement agencies in Estonia. Henceforth, such groups were treated with greater attention and caution. Anna and Marcus Valgu lost custody and the opportunity to see Rasmus. Oller Vesky received his sentence. But despite the official closure, the story lived on in the memory of all those involved. It became a bitter reminder of how easily people can lose themselves under external influence and how high the price for such mistakes can be. Work Order Number 734. A typical request, no different from dozens of others received daily. The phrasing is short: blockage, industrial sector. For utility services, this is standard routine. Drive out, inspect, clear, draw up a report. No one suspects that behind this line in the work log lies something that will change not only their day, but also launch one of the most high-profile investigations of recent years. The crew drives to the site. The senior, the driver, and the technician. All three are experienced with practiced movements without fuss. The area is the outskirts of Nairobi, an old industrial zone, long disused for its original purpose. Rusty fences, empty hangars, a dusty road that seems to have seen no machinery for years. According to the plan, a buried collector, remaining from the time of British communications, should run here. A simple check. Ensure there is no blockage, make a note, return. But from the very first minutes, something is off. The coordinates match, but the object on site is not the right one. Instead of an open plot of land, there is a huge concrete structure, old in appearance but strangely well maintained. No signs of destruction, no trash, no vegetation around. The concrete is smooth, without cracks, as if it had been recently cleaned. The impression is that this place is being kept in order, although officially it should be abandoned. The crew senior takes out a map and cross-references it with the blueprints. The discrepancy is 100%. On paper, emptiness. On the ground, a massive object that is not mentioned in any city database. No signs, markings, or identification labels. This no longer looks like a mistake, but rather something no one was supposed to know about. The workers inspect the perimeter. At first, everything seems quiet, but after a few minutes, the technician notices a strange sound. A hum. Low, steady, as if from underground. Not sharp, not loud, but rather background, constant. All three fall silent and try to identify the source. They turn off the car engine, and the hum becomes clearer. It's not machinery and not ventilation. The sound has no rhythm. It doesn't resemble a pump or a turbine. It just exists, as if something is slowly moving inside the void. They walk along the wall, listening. In one spot, the hum noticeably intensifies. The ground under their feet sinks slightly, and a light kick with a boot produces a metallic sound. They begin to clear the area. Several minutes later, it becomes visible. A manhole cover is hidden beneath a layer of dust and sand, heavy, made of dark metal, without rust, without any markings. It is clearly not municipal. Such covers are not used for drainage systems. The senior tries to lift it with a crowbar, but the cover does not budge, as if sealed or cemented around the perimeter. They decide not to touch it further. According to instructions, upon discovering unknown structures, work must be immediately stopped, the find documented, and the data transmitted to the central dispatch point. The senior takes out his phone, takes 3 pictures of the manhole cover, 1 general shot, and records the coordinates. Then he calls the duty officer and briefly reports, Anomaly at the site. An unaccounted for concrete structure has been discovered. A source of non-mechanical sound has been detected. Verification required. The duty officer asks for the time, 11:42. The request is registered, and in this transmitted to field, a note appears. Nairobi Police. The workers remain on site for some time, discussing among themselves what it could be. There are many versions: an old military storage facility, a technical bunker, a substation. But none of them explain the sound. The manhole cover is too strong, the concrete too fresh, and everything around is too clean. 20 minutes later, a patrol arrives. 2 officers, unhurried, with customary politeness. They take the coordinates, inspect the area, and ask the workers not to leave until an engineer from the city inspection arrives. At this moment, no one, neither the police nor the utility workers, suspects that this call has launched a chain of events that will soon lead to a discovery that will later shake the entire city. What began as a check for a routine blockage becomes the first link in an investigation that will uncover a hidden network and lead the investigation into underground areas whose existence official maps had been silent about for decades. Archive shelf number 14 stands at the far end of the corridor where few employees ever go. It's always a bit cool there, the lights flicker, and the dust on the floor is no longer cleaned. There's no point. Hardly anyone goes there. On the metal shelves are folders with gray covers and faded labels. Missing persons minors. They stand in a dense row, sometimes 2 layers deep. On the spines are dates: 2005, 2007, 2011, 2015, 2018. Each such folder is a frozen story that no one has ever returned to. When you open one of them, the first thing that strikes you is the uniformity. Everything is formatted according to a template: registration number, applicant's name, address, date of disappearance, and then empty fields. The sheets have yellowed on some, the stamp of the district precinct is barely visible. The handwriting varies, sometimes hurried, sometimes neat, but the meaning is always the same. Someone disappeared and no one knows how. From 2005 to 2023, 487 such cases accumulated in this archive. Different families, different circumstances, but the structure repeats itself. Teenagers from the outskirts disappeared, younger siblings from large families, kids who worked odd jobs in markets or simply lived near industrial zones. None of them were directly connected to each other, but all cases were from the same areas where the police only appeared in emergencies. Each case has a short story. In a protocol from 2008, a woman writes, "He was playing by the road. I turned away for a minute." This is the only sentence in the statement, besides the signature. No exact time, no witnesses. Immediately after this comes the phrasing, "No signs of crime found. Further measures are not expedient." 9 years later, a similar case. 2017, a different district, a different inspector, different handwriting. Did not come home from school after classes. No teachers' names, no testimonies. In the search results column, there is a dash. In the last contact column, a date, and next to it, a pencil note, "Not found." These are not coincidences. This is a pattern, the same scenario stretched over decades. Children disappeared, investigations began, then stalled, and a year later, the cases went to the archive. There, on the lower shelves, from where no one ever retrieved them again. If you look at the statistics, everything becomes even more obvious. 95% of the applications concerned low-income families. These are slums, suburbs, temporary settlements, where there is no permanent registration. People often could not even fill out the application correctly. Some did not have a passport, some did not know the exact address. Because of this, some appeals were not officially recorded. It turned out that a person had disappeared, but on paper, no one was looking for them. The investigators who worked on these cases rotated. They left, transferred, resigned. No systemic connection was made. Everyone thought they were working on a separate case. Documents from district offices entered the city database, then the archive. Some did not even make it there. They were lost in the process or returned with the note, "Insufficient data." Inside these folders are copies of passports, faded photographs, recordings from old cameras made on VHS. Sometimes a sheet with the note, "No result," is attached to the case. This is all that remained. The last summary for all these cases is dated 2021. Since then, not a single new entry, not a single attempt to resume the investigation. Most cases have officially been assigned cold case status. This is a dry term that in reality means one thing: the investigation has ceased. Not because it was solved, but because there are no more resources. No one goes to the scene, conducts interrogations, or makes inquiries to hospitals. Everything just stops. In one of the reports, the head of the department directly writes, "No active investigative actions are being carried out. The potential for disclosure is absent." This phrase becomes a de facto sentence, not to the criminal, but to the cases themselves. This situation persisted until the spring of 2023, until that very entry entered the system. Short, technical, made by the senior of the utility crew. Coordinates, a note about a strange sound, time, 11:42. No one then connected this call with the archive. No one could have predicted that it would be precisely this call that would lift from the bottom shelf a folder that had been considered hopeless for almost 20 years. And it is from this moment that all these numbers, 487 missing, 487 abandoned cases, will cease to be statistics. Because for the first time in many years, there will be a chance that at least one of them will receive an answer. Patrol car number 52 arrived at the scene at 11:56. On duty were Sergeant Mwangi and Constable Kariyuki, a regular pair who were scheduled to finish their shift in 2 hours. The call was categorized as an infrastructure anomaly, and initially, no one suspected it was anything serious. Such reports come in frequently. Old mines, illegal dumping, sometimes just false alarms. But from the dispatcher's voice alone, relaying the coordinates, the tension was palpable. He clarified, "Utility workers reported a metal manhole cover without markings. They say there's a strange sound coming from inside." The industrial zone they arrived at looked like hundreds of others: semi-ruined warehouses, overgrown territory, abandoned containers. The sun was high, the heat was dense, the air still. The utility workers who made the call were waiting by the van. 4 men in orange vests, silent and visibly nervous. One of them immediately approached the patrol and pointed to a concrete platform 20 meters from the road. There, among weeds and cracks, and perfectly flat square slab was visible, as if someone had recently poured it, although all the other concrete around was old and cracked. The officers cross-referenced their tablet, on satellite images and the city map. Nothing. No collector, no drainage, no underground line. Even on the engineering diagrams they had access to, this area was marked as abandoned. Mwangi knelt down and tapped the metal cover with a crowbar. The sound was dull, with an echo, meaning there was an empty space beneath the slab. The constable recorded the coordinates and took several photos with his service phone. Everything looked less like an old structure and more like a recently installed object that no one knew anything about. They decided to lift the cover to make sure it wasn't an emergency outlet or illegal drain. The mechanism was strangely tight. As they pried up the cover, they felt a dense, heavy air escape from beneath it, and almost immediately, a smell hit them. Not just sewage, not chemicals. It was a smell that was difficult to describe, but one that instantly made them instinctively recoil. A mixture of decay, dampness, and something resembling burnt plastic. The air was warm, thick, with a metallic aftertaste. One of the officers immediately covered his face with his hand. The other recorded in his report, strong organic smell detected. Later, experts would confirm the air indeed contained organic compounds. But at that moment, no one yet understood how important this observation was. According to protocol, an inspection was to be conducted. One officer remained on the surface, the other descended. Sergeant Mwangi secured a rope to a metal stand, put on gloves, turned on his flashlight and body camera. The beam of light picked out the lower level, a narrow passage leading downwards at an angle. The walls were of rough concrete, in places covered with metal sheets, and there were traces of moisture on the floor. Descending slowly, he felt the temperature drop. The air became denser, and the smell intensified. At about 3 meters, the flashlight caught something resembling movement. At first, it seemed to be just a reflection of light from a drop of water. But then the shadow shifted, as if someone had moved there. The sergeant froze, listening. From the depths, a quiet, ragged breathing could be heard. He signaled upwards, a short coded signal, and continued his descent. At the floor level of the tunnel, the flashlight caught uneven contours. At first it seemed like sacks or rags, but one of them changed position. A second later, it became clear. It was a person, weak, emaciated, sitting against the wall. The sergeant took a step forward, directed the flashlight, and saw several more figures. They moved, but very slowly. Some raised their heads, squinting at the light. At this moment, his faltering voice was heard over the radio. "I see people. I repeat, I see people." On the surface, the constable tensed, asking for clarification. How many? The answer came with a pause. Many. A few seconds later, an addition. Looks like all young. While they were contacting the dispatcher above ground, sounds began to emanate from the depths of the tunnel. Not screams, not speech, just many voices merging into a hum. Someone was calling, someone was crying, someone was just whispering. The noise echoed off the walls, creating the sensation that there was a whole hall full of people underground. At 12:15, the duty station recorded the call. Unidentified underground facility. Large number of people, unknown condition. Code 1033 was assigned. Emergency situation. 7 minutes later, the first special response team was already deploying from the base. The area was cordoned off. Roads were blocked by patrols, and dozens of people gathered around. Workers, residents of neighboring houses, journalists who had somehow learned about the call. On the concrete platform, where utility workers had stood just a few hours ago, a full-fledged headquarters was now established. For the officers standing at the open manhole, everything seemed like a nightmare that had appeared out of nowhere. They had come on a routine call, and in a matter of minutes found themselves witnesses to what would later be called the largest discovery in the city's history. Beneath the layer of concrete, beneath the mundane industrial zone, began a story that would change everything, from the city police to international agencies. From this moment, the accidental manhole becomes the starting point of an investigation that will uncover a long-standing, meticulously hidden system that existed right under the feet of Nairobi residents. 20 minutes after the alarm, the investigative operational group arrived at the old industrial zone. Several cars, ambulances, a technical van, and a mobile laboratory. The area was already cordoned off by then. Patrols had blocked access roads and dozens of people had gathered around. Workers, residents of nearby houses, journalists who had somehow learned about the call. On the concrete platform, where utility workers had stood just a few hours ago, a full-fledged headquarters was now set up. The first to descend were forensic specialists. Lighting was temporarily installed, spotlights on tripods. As soon as they turned on the light, it became clear that it wasn't just a room underground. It was a network, several corridors converging into a central compartment. The walls were smooth, with clear geometry, as if they were made not crudely, but according to a plan. The vaults were arched, ventilation was routed into the ceiling, the floor was compacted. Along the walls were traces of old metal partitions, and in the depths, a wide door leading to a warehouse. When the specialists entered, it became clear that this was not a temporary shelter. Everything was too well thought out. Separate rooms, shelves, makeshift bunks, remnants of plastic dishes. On the walls, wires, remnants of lighting lamps, and everywhere, traces of human presence. By that time, medics had already brought the first people up. They were exhausted in a severe physical condition. Many could not speak. Some did not open their eyes to the light. Doctors would later record extreme exhaustion, dehydration, signs of prolonged malnutrition. On the surface, ambulance crews worked, setting up tents, preparing stretchers. Police continued to explore the underground facilities. Gradually, new passages were discovered. According to preliminary estimates, the length of the tunnels exceeded 100 meters. The corridors connected on several levels, and on each level, separate rooms, like cells. When they started counting people, the numbers astonished everyone. According to the initial inspection, 312 people were found inside. Most were young, some very small. Doctors would later specify that many of them had not left the underground for years. Some showed signs of avidominosis, muscle atrophy, joint deformities. The medical commission recorded cases of anemia, infections, and complete loss of adaptation to sunlight. Investigators continued their work. In one of the rooms closer to the center of the complex, they noticed scratches on the walls. At first, they thought it was just cracks, but on closer inspection, it became clear. These were rows of marks made with fingernails or a piece of metal, similar to a calendar. Each line was neat, straight, grouped by 7. In some places, they intersected, as if someone was keeping track of time, then lost count and started again. This detail changed the course of the inspection. It became obvious that the people underground were not just there by chance. They lived. They adapted, tried to maintain order. In another room, they found a makeshift table, plastic containers, pieces of fabric turned into bedding. And under one of the walls, where there had apparently been a makeshift storage, lay an empty package of powdered milk. The production date, October 2015, was preserved on it. This item became the first material evidence. The package was carefully placed in a transparent bag and recorded in the protocol as number 1. For the investigation, this was critically important. For the first time, there was a point of reference. The date itself meant that the object had been in use for at least 8 years. Not as a short-term shelter, but as a stable, long-term place of confinement. All this completely changed the context of the incident. If previously the police viewed the situation as illegal detention of people, now it was about something systemic, prolonged, planned. On the same day, the investigation status was reclassified. The new wording was official, unemotional. Case of especially prolonged illegal detention of a group of persons. These words entered the first report of the operational headquarters. But behind the dry lines lay the main thing. A network had been uncovered beneath Nairobi that had existed for almost 10 years. And the very next day, investigators would understand that the scale of this story went far beyond one city. The first thing investigators do the next morning is send an inquiry to the City Land Registry. This is a standard procedure, but it's usually where the most convoluted cases begin. They need to understand who owns the plot where that concrete manhole and the underground network were located. The answer comes quickly. The land is registered to a private company. At first glance, nothing unusual. In Nairobi, many warehouses, even old ones, are still registered to legal entities that no one remembers anymore. But then, the strangeness. The owner company is listed as Nairobi Logistics Solutions. According to documents, it was registered in the early 2000s, dealt with warehouse logistics, and was officially liquidated in 2010. That is, more than 10 years ago. And all this time, for some reason, the plot did not transfer to the state. Investigators send an additional request to the archive of the registration chamber. There, it is confirmed. Indeed, the firm ceased to exist. The management is not established. The last report was submitted for 2009, in the responsible person field. Empty. It seems like a dead end, but the investigation has one tool left, to check the tax history of the plot. If the company is dead, then no one should be paying tax. And if taxes are being paid, then someone continues to maintain fictitious ownership. The answer arrives within an hour. According to the tax service, there are no arrears on this property. All contributions have been paid regularly annually without a single miss. Moreover, payment was made not by transfers, but in cash, directly through the same bank branch in the city center. This is serious. Cash payments are a way to leave no digital trace, and if someone has been bringing money in person for years, then that person definitely knew what they were hiding. The investigator requests extracts of cash vouchers. In the bank's archive, they find a whole stack of old receipts. The handwriting varies, but the signature is the same. All documents indicate one name, Joseph Kamau. It repeats in payment records starting from 2011 and ending literally a month before the manhole was discovered. This discovery instantly changes the direction of the investigation. Now, the police have not just an anonymous plot, but a specific name. Through the citizen database, Kamau's identity is established. A man, 62 years old, a former warehouse worker at one of the wholesale companies, lives 5 kilometers from the industrial zone, on the outskirts of the Eastleigh district. The house is modest, single-story, with rusty gates and an old pickup truck under a shed. Neighbors describe him as a reclusive, almost taciturn person. They say he lives alone, sometimes goes to the store, but rarely talks to anyone. According to documents, no criminal record, no debts, no special distinguishing features. An ordinary pensioner. But now this name links the man to the underground complex where more than 300 people were found. At 3:30 p.m., after a meeting at headquarters, investigators received court sanction. An official warrant is issued for the arrest of Joseph Kamau for interrogation. From this moment, his status changes. He becomes the main suspect in the case of illegal detention of people. That same evening, the operational group deploys to the address. The yard is quiet, the street empty, the sun already setting. The car stops at the gates. Officers get out and take positions. The first attempt begins to establish contact with the person whose name, as will soon be revealed, is connected to a much larger network than a single underground warehouse. While investigators were busy searching for the landowner, other, no less important work continued on site. In the makeshift field hospital, set up right next to the warehouse territory, doctors and psychologists began to interview those who had been brought out of the underground facilities. The process was slow, exhausting. Medics recorded severe exhaustion, dehydration, and signs of chronic malnutrition. Many could barely stand, did not immediately understand where they were or what was happening. For the investigation, this was one of the most difficult tasks: identification. People could not recall their last name, address, or parents. Some only gave a first name. Some were confused about the years. Some spoke so softly that doctors recorded every word syllable by syllable. In most cases, memories were fragments, snippets of old conversations, a street name, the smell of home, a familiar name. This did not provide a complete picture. Then investigators took another approach. They began to cross-reference photos with the database of missing persons. This was a titanic effort, manually checking faces, ages, approximate time of disappearance. The first few hours, nothing matched. But then, closer to evening, the first confirmation appeared. One of the girls, who was admitted to the hospital in an extremely weak condition, was in the database. Her photograph was in a 2018 missing persons case. She had been searched for several months then, but the trail ended abruptly at a bus stop in downtown Nairobi. Her parents gave interviews, asked for help through television, but the case was closed as unsuccessful. Now it became clear. All this time, she had been underground. After this match, the process accelerated. A second match, a third, then a 10th. All the stories repeated with frightening accuracy. People disappeared suddenly, on their way to school, from the market, during small errands. Almost all were from poor areas, from the outskirts. No one was kidnapped for money. There were no calls, letters, or ransoms. Those who disappeared were from families who could not afford a lawyer, did not know journalists, and had no connection to authorities. When the number of matches exceeded 36, the investigation was able to formulate the first pattern. All victims were people without proper supervision, vulnerable, socially inconspicuous. Their disappearances attracted little attention, which is why the scheme worked for so long. The criminals deliberately chose those whose absence would not cause a stir. Next began the work of medical experts. It was necessary to understand what had been happening underground all these years. But the examination results only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of severe beatings, coercion, or other evidence of physical abuse on the bodies. This completely debunked the initial hypothesis of violence. Investigators also checked a second possible version: ransom. But in 18 years, not a single case contained even a hint of demands for money. The exploitation theory also did not fit. The people found below showed no signs of labor, no calluses, no industrial injuries. It seemed that all they did was simply live, without external contact, without light, without going outside. In the end, the investigation was left with only one inexplicable fact. Everything that happened had no usual motive. No one tried to profit, did not use them as labor, and did not make demands. Everything indicated that isolation itself was the goal. Someone had been creating a closed system underground for many years, holding people for no explainable reason. This detail changed the tone of the investigation. Now, investigators understood that the case was not just about a crime against an individual. It was something more, an organization that had a goal, a structure, and means. And that meant the main task lay ahead: to understand who and why needed to hide people underground in the very center of Nairobi for decades. The arrest operation began in the middle of the day. 2 special forces vehicles and an investigative team arrived on the street where Joseph Kamau lived. The area was quiet, a private sector, several old houses along a narrow road. None of the neighbors came out when the police approached the gates. By standard procedure, they first tried to ring the doorbell. There was no answer. Then the door was forced open. The house turned out to be small, single-story, with an unkempt yard. Inside, neat but strangely empty. In the kitchen, a couple of plates, a gas stove, an old kettle. In the bedroom, a bed, a bedside table, a couple of shirts. Everything looked like an ordinary elderly person living alone who doesn't like guests. But there was a feeling that the owner had left recently. The frying pan on the stove was still warm, and near the door were rubber boots with fresh mud that hadn't dried yet. The inspection took over 1 hour. The investigators went through all the rooms, but nothing directly linking Kamau to the warehouse was found. No documents, no photos, no notes, not even a computer or a phone, nothing. It was as if the person knew in advance that they would be coming for him and had removed everything that could compromise him. As the operatives were about to leave, one of them noticed a metal hatch in the backyard, covered by a sheet of plywood. Beneath it was a ladder leading down. There, under the house, was a small basement. At first glance, it was an ordinary utility room. Concrete walls, a lamp on the ceiling, a box of tools. But in the corner stood a new modern door with a code lock. From the outside, it was painted to look like old metal, but upon closer inspection, it turned out to have been installed recently. The door was opened. Behind it was a small room, about 6 square meters. The walls and ceiling were covered with sound-insulating material. The floor was concrete, with no objects, furniture, or traces of life. Only one ventilation duct led to the back wall. No windows, no wiring, no signs that anyone had lived there. Just an empty, perfectly quiet room. This discovery changed the entire perception of the house. There was no domestic reason for such a room to exist. It could not serve as a pantry or a workshop. The ventilation and sound insulation suggested otherwise. This place was created so that no one would hear what was happening inside. Experts would later determine that the sound insulation was professional, industrial-grade material used in studios and laboratories. The installation was expensive. This meant that Kamau had access to resources that an ordinary former warehouse worker should not have had. Investigators questioned the neighbors. Everyone described him the same way. Quiet, withdrawn, never invited anyone over. No one had noticed anyone visiting him. Only sometimes in the evenings they heard the sound of a generator running, as if he was fixing something in the basement. One neighbor said that he had once seen a van pulling up to the house at night, but he did not manage to remember the license plate number. At the time of the search, Kamau himself was not at home. Everything indicated that he had left the residence shortly before the police arrived. He took a minimum of belongings, no suitcases, just a jacket and documents. Surveillance cameras installed at the exit of the district recorded a man resembling him. The time was morning of the same day, 3 hours before the group arrived. After that, the trail went cold. That same evening, the police officially declared Joseph Kamau a nationally wanted person. His name and photograph were published in all news broadcasts. Law enforcement warned that the man could be dangerous, might not be acting alone, and possibly was connected to a network that had been operating for decades. From that moment, the story ceased to be local. Now the investigation concerned not just a person who had fled after suspicion, but a link in a chain that, as investigators began to realize, went much deeper, into a structure that had funding, organization, and access to state data. When the investigation stalled due to Kamau's escape, the investigators had no choice but to return to where it all began, the warehouse. This is standard practice. After a major discovery and initial reports, one always returns to recheck the details. But in this case, the return was not just a formality. The group still had too many inconsistencies, too many small technical puzzles that required answers. Forensic experts arrived at the site early in the morning. The area was already cordoned off and under guard. They worked in protective suits, masks, and gloves. A pungent smell of dampness and something unnatural, which could not be precisely identified, still lingered in the premises. It was the smell of old concrete, burning, and stale air. The ventilation, it turned out, was barely functioning. That is why it was decided to conduct a detailed inspection of it. Specialists removed the grates, checked the shafts, and measured the depth of the channels. Usually, such systems lead to one of the main collector lines, but here the structure was more complex. It did not follow a plan, but seemed to have been created manually without coordination with city services. One of the engineers noticed a strange bend leading to the side wall. When a camera was directed there, the image showed something uncharacteristic. Not debris, not construction waste. There, deep in the channel, something soft, dense, wrapped in fabric, was stuck. The object was carefully extracted. It was covered in dust and remnants of cobwebs, but when it was brought to the surface, it became clear that it was an old canvas bag. The rope with which it was tied disintegrated in their hands, the fabric in places cracked with age. No one spoke a word. Everyone understood that there were no random objects in such a place. The bag was placed on a plastic tarp, cameras were turned on, and the protocol was initiated. It was opened slowly, layer by layer, so as not to damage possible evidence. The first thing seen was footwear, small pairs, different in shape, but similar in size. Some had already disintegrated, others were well preserved. On top of the shoes were several backpacks, old, worn, faded. Inside were small personal items, pencils, notebooks, scraps of paper, erasers, even an old plastic keychain in the shape of a football. When the forensic expert opened one of the backpacks, a thin school notebook fell out. The paper had yellowed, the edges were damp, but inside, neat handwriting could still be deciphered. In a column, mathematical examples, dates in the corner, October 2012. On the cover, in the top line, handwritten with a blue ink pen, was the name Samuel Njogu. These few letters became the first real anchor point in the entire investigation. Until this moment, the items found were impersonal, just a collection of objects, no indication that they belonged to specific people. And now, the case had a name, linked to the past, a name that could be checked. The investigator immediately requested access to the department's missing persons archives. The answer came in half an hour. In 2012, a boy with that name was indeed reported missing. The district was Kahawa West. He disappeared on his way home from school. The investigation at the time lasted 3 weeks. Teachers, neighbors, even Matatu drivers were interviewed, but no trace was found. Then the case was sent to the archive. Now, 13 years later, this name reappeared, but in a different context. In a bag, hidden deep in a ventilation shaft under the warehouse, where no one had entered for years. This bag became not just an exhibit. It became proof that the crimes mentioned in the reports had a common point, that those who had disappeared for decades did not vanish by chance. Someone collected their personal belongings, preserved them, hid them, not because they wanted to get rid of evidence, but as if they were storing them. At the investigative team's headquarters, this moment was called a turning point. A new stage of the case began with this episode. For the first time, the police were able to link the underground warehouse to a specific person from an old case that had been considered hopeless. After that, the inspection protocols were rewritten. Every shaft, every meter of ventilation was rechecked. Investigators began looking for other similar bags and found more and more signs that someone had been returning here for many years, systematically, with a specific purpose. Now, the story ceased to be just a horrific discovery by utility workers. It turned into a case where every little thing was part of a large, elaborate scheme. And the discovery with the name of Samuel Njogu became the first link in the chain that was supposed to lead investigators to those who were hiding behind this entire system. Samuel Njogu's notebook was sent to the laboratory the day after it was found. Experts knew that, on paper that had lain in dust for more than 10 years, no traces might remain. But in this case, they could not afford to miss even the smallest detail. The material was treated with a gentle reagent, one that does not destroy old paper and allows fingerprints to be revealed even through layers of dust. Each sheet was checked under ultraviolet light, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, so as not to miss anything. When the first outlines of lines appeared, a tense silence hung in the laboratory. There were fingerprints, and not just one. Several small, partially smudged ones probably belonged to Samuel himself. But among them, another stood out, larger, clearer, left by an older person. The one who held this notebook in their hands was certainly not a student. The expert took a high-resolution photograph and uploaded it to the digital archive for comparison. The fingerprint was loaded into the Automated Identification System, or AIS. This is a database containing millions of dactyloscopy cards collected over decades. The system usually takes minutes to work, but in such cases, every wait feels like an eternity. On the screen, the loading bar slowly progressed. The program analyzed the curves of the lines, the points of intersection, the distance between the swirls. Each match was evaluated as a percentage. The laboratory was completely silent, only the hum of fans and the monotonous buzzing of the processor. Specialists did not take their eyes off the monitor, as if the result depended on how intensely they stared at it. After a few minutes, the screen flickered. The top line read, "Match found. Reliability level, 100%. Below this inscription, the name, Joseph Kamau. This was the very person the police had been searching for several weeks. His fingerprint, found on Samuel Njogu's notebook, which belonged to one of those reported missing since 2012, became direct proof of the connection. Now, it was not a hypothesis, not a coincidence of addresses, and not circumstantial evidence. It was a fact confirmed by the laboratory. According to the Ministry of Internal Affairs database, Kamau's dactyloscopic data had been entered back in 1998 after a minor theft from the warehouse where he then worked as a storekeeper. He was given a suspended sentence at the time, and the case was quickly forgotten. But the record remained in the system, and it was that record that now played a key role. Legally, this result changed everything. Kamau's fingerprint on Samuel's notebook was a direct link between the suspect and one of the missing persons. By law, such an expert result is equivalent to personal contact with an exhibit, and that meant the investigation now had an ironclad argument. From that moment on, the case ceased to be a chain of guesses. The investigation officially recognized Joseph Kamau was not just the owner of the warehouse, not a random tenant or guard. He was the one who physically contacted the personal belongings of people held underground. The laboratory protocol with the expert result was sent to the central office in the evening at 2017. An hour later, a document was signed expanding the international search. Now Kamau was being sought not only within Kenya, but also beyond its borders. All of this became the first solid confirmation that the case extended beyond a local incident. Facing the investigation was a man who had remained in the shadows for years, behaved like an ordinary suburban resident, and in fact, possibly stood at the origins of one of the most massive and carefully hidden disappearance schemes in the country's history. After the fingerprint confirmation, the investigators finally had a real lead. But even with such strong evidence, the case did not seem complete. The evidence pointed to Kamau, but too much in his biography did not match the profile of an organizer. He lived modestly, with no signs of wealth, did not own a car, and did not own real estate. The house he lived in was old in a low-rent area. According to documents, he was an ordinary pensioner receiving benefits. But in criminal cases, one rule always works flawlessly. If you don't understand the motive, look for money. The financial audit began with a basic analysis of his banking operations. They expected to see zeros, old, forgotten accounts, perhaps traces of small withdrawals. But the result was different. Regular transfers were being deposited into Kamau's personal account. Once a month, almost like clockwork. The amounts were not huge but stable, slightly more than $500. For a person who had not had official employment since 2009, this seemed suspicious. The forensic accounting department prepared a statement. All transfers came from one source, an organization called Hope of Africa. Formally, it was a registered charity foundation established to help orphan children affected by natural disasters. According to documents, the fund received private donations and directed them to maintain orphanages and educational programs. But the purpose of the transfers to Kamau's account seems strange. Administrative expenses. Such wording is usually used when the real purpose of the funds is to be concealed. Investigators requested information about the fund's leadership. The response, which arrived a day later, only heightened suspicions. Dr. Patrick Wandera, a well-known public figure in the country, was listed as the head of Hope of Africa. He was often featured in television reports, spoke at conferences, met with officials, and talked about humanitarian missions. In the public sphere, Wandera was an almost impeccable figure, with a reputation as someone who had dedicated his life to helping those in difficult circumstances. At first glance, the connection between Wandera and Kamau seemed impossible. One was a philanthropist with diplomas and awards, the other, an elderly former warehouse worker living on the outskirts of Nairobi, but the payments spoke for themselves. Transfers were recorded for 10 years, starting in 2011, and each time the amount arrived strictly on the same dates through the same bank branch. When investigators checked the movement of funds within the foundation, it turned out that these administrative expenses did not pass through the main reports. They were not in the accounting summaries provided to government regulators. The money came from a so-called reserve fund account, a closed account to which only the chairman had access. That is, all transfers to Kamau came directly from Wandera. At this stage, the investigation began to consider a new theory. Perhaps Kamau was not the organizer, but the Ispolnidal, executor, a person who carried out assignments for which he received stable payments. And the fund itself was just a cover for activities that took place in the shadows. The organization had both motive, resources, and most importantly, access. Under the guise of helping orphans, representatives of the fund had the opportunity to contact families where the situation was unfavorable, where no one asked unnecessary questions, and where the disappearance of a person could go unnoticed. The Hope of Africa Fund fit this scheme perfectly. On the surface, aid, humanitarian missions, fundraising. Inside, cash flows, opaque expenses, and dozens of closed facilities across the country, where temporary shelters could officially be located. After cross-referencing all data, the police officially added Patrick Wandera to the database as the second suspect in the case. Now, the investigation was proceeding in two directions at once. The search for Kamau continued, but at the same time, the development of the fund and its leadership began. Thus, the case, which began with a routine call to the utility service, turned into a national-scale investigation, where a charitable organization could turn out to be the central element of a multi-year disappearance scheme. 3 days after Patrick Wandera's name officially appeared in the case files, the investigative team obtained a warrant to seize documents at the Hope of Africa Foundation office. The operation was carried out without much fanfare. The building was located in Nairobi's business center, on one of the upper floors of an office complex housing banks, advertising agencies, and international NGO representative offices. Outside were glass walls, a logo with a blue outline of Africa, and the slogan, "Helping those who have lost everything." Investigators entered around 9 in the morning, just as the foundation's employees were arriving for work. Formally, everything looked impeccable: neat offices, an orderly archive, and accounting in place. But the very first comparison of data raised doubts. Reports submitted to international donors stated that the organization monthly supported over 3,000 beneficiaries across the country. The lists included dozens of locations, hundreds of names, photographs, and curator signatures. Everything looked official, even too official. When a physical check was conducted at the addresses specified in the documents, the numbers did not match. Where 200 to 300 people were reported to live, there were actually small shelters for 20 to 30. The discrepancy was systemic, not accidental. It turned out that the vast majority of beneficiaries existed only on paper. In official documents, thousands of lives; in reality, dozens. Further auditing showed that a significant portion of the funds received from donors passed through the foundation for only a few days, after which it was withdrawn as cash. This scheme is often used in black accounting, when it is necessary to conceal the real destination of money. The funds were cashed out through the same bank, through the same cashier, and the recipient's signature on the receipts invariably belonged to Patrick Wandera. The investigation requested his personal file to understand who he was before becoming a public figure. In the archives of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, an interesting record was found. In 2007, Wandera had already been involved in an investigation related to illegal adoption. At that time, it concerned forged documents used to take several minors abroad. The case was closed with the formulation, "insufficient evidence," and shortly thereafter, Wandera established his fund. This episode explained a lot. A person who once participated in schemes involving illegal custody arrangements, a few years later, becomes the head of a large charitable organization. and in his new status, he gains unlimited access to those who were under the care of the state or foundations. Gradually, a new picture emerged. The abducted children, held in underground premises, could be used not as victims in the literal sense, but as a tool for financial manipulation. The fund presented them in reports as beneficiaries, whose photographs were sent to donors. Each donor, receiving a photo and the story of a saved child, transferred money. The more stories, the more donations. The warehouse near Nairobi, in essence, was a resource, physical confirmation of these dead souls. People no one was looking for were transformed into proof of the existence of humanitarian programs, for which the fund received millions. Outwardly, it looked like conscientious work. Reports, photos, signatures, thank you letters. In reality, a massive scam disguised as charity. Investigators for the first time articulated the motive that explained everything. Money, not a cult, not cruelty, not fanaticism. Ordinary cold fraud, meticulously planned and existing for almost 20 years. Everything that happened in the underground premises had an exclusively financial goal: to create the illusion of care so that thousands of saved individuals would be listed in reports to foreign funds. Now, the investigation needed to prove exactly how the organizers transferred these funds, and who else was involved in the chain. After all, it was obvious that Wandera was not acting alone. Ahead were financial examinations, new arrests, and a series of high-profile revelations that were to finally unveil the full extent of this story. The morning the operation began was like dozens of previous investigation days, quiet, with no signs of a major climax. But it was on this day that the police decided to act simultaneously. At 9:40, a group from the Economic Crimes Department entered the office of the Hope of Africa Foundation. Wandera was in his office behind a glass partition, preparing for an online meeting with donors. When the warrant was presented to him, he initially disbelieved. He tried to joke, smiled, explained that there must have been a mistake. But the further the investigator read the charges, the more noticeably his hand trembled. A few minutes later, he was led out in handcuffs. Almost at the same time, on the other side of the city, near the central bus station where inner-city buses gathered, patrol officers detained a man who was trying to buy a ticket to Mombasa. One of the police officers recognized him from a description gray-haired, with a bag on his shoulder and an old driver's license in his hands. It was Joseph Kamau. He did not resist, simply looked towards the road, as if understanding that the game was over. 2 hours later, both suspects were already at the Central Police Headquarters. They were taken to different interrogation rooms. The investigators deliberately synchronized the interrogations. This is a psychological technique that often works better than any pressure. Two people, linked by one secret, sit in different rooms, but each knows. In the next room, the other may already be talking. Wandera, as expected, immediately chose a strategy of denial. From the first minutes, he confidently asserted that the fund operated legally, that all reports passed inspection, and that the accusations were the result of a misunderstanding, or perhaps someone's attempt to tarnish his name. He spoke at length calmly, choosing his words, trying to control the conversation. His demeanor was polished, as if he were giving an interview, not testimony. Kamau, on the other hand, was silent. He sat with his head down, answering monosyllabically. His hands rested on the table, and his gaze constantly drifted aside. He neither denied nor confirmed anything. The silence lasted for almost 40 minutes until the investigator placed a photograph on the table, the very notebook of Samuel and Njogu, and a sheet with the results of the dactyloscopic examination. "This is your fingerprint," the investigator said, "on the page where the name of a boy who disappeared 13 years ago is written." Kamau tensed his shoulders slightly but did not raise his eyes. Then the investigator used a final trick of bluff. He leaned closer and whispered, "Patrick Wandera has already given testimony. He said you did everything yourself, that you kidnapped, and he knew nothing." These words worked. The silence that had lasted for more than an hour was broken almost imperceptibly. First, Kamau simply raised his head, then for a few seconds looked directly at the investigator. In his gaze, there was something between weariness and despair, as if he finally understood that hiding was no longer pointless. He exhaled and said softly but clearly, "I will tell," but he promised it would just be a shelter. These words were entered into the protocol. After them, the interrogation continued all night. Gradually, Kamal began to recount how he met Wandera, how he received an offer from him to look after the warehouse, how people began to be brought there, and why he, seeing all this, did not stop. His confession became a key moment in the case. It not only confirmed the investigation's theory, but also for the first time revealed the internal mechanics of a criminal scheme in which human lives were turned into numbers and reports for alienated donors abroad. Thus began a new stage one, where the truth could no longer be stopped by money, connections, or fear. After a night of interrogations, when Camo finally spoke, the investigation got what they had been missing all those weeks: direction. His testimony was disjointed. At times he was confused, making excuses, but one thing was clear. All financial transactions related to the warehouse were conducted not through a bank, but through a separate accounting system, known only to two people, him and Patrick Wandera. According to him, all real amounts and expense distributions were recorded manually, without electronic traces, and stored not in the general archive of the foundation, but in Wandera's personal safe, right in his office, behind a decorative wooden panel. This information immediately changed the course of the case. On the morning of the same day, a warrant for a second search was issued. Kamau, at the request of the investigators, was present when the group departed. This was a rare case when a suspect is brought directly to the scene to show exactly where to look. When they entered the Foundation's office, the employees on duty after yesterday's events stepped aside. Wandera was already under arrest, so the office was sealed. Kamau pointed to the wall behind the desk, where at first glance there was nothing remarkable. The panel indeed turned out to be movable, and behind it was a built-in metal box, secured with a code lock. Employees opened the safe under protocol. Inside were two folders, one neatly signed, the other without identifying marks, with a cover darkened by time and fingerprints. The first folder contained exactly what everyone expected to see: official reports of the Foundation, printed tables, financial summaries, signed with the seals of donors and sponsors. On paper, exemplary transparency. But the second folder, that was the final point. It contained notebooks with uneven, hasty handwriting. Dates, amounts, short notes, all handwritten. No signatures, no seals. Leafing through the pages, the investigator noticed several recurring lines. Among them was one that would later become a key piece of evidence. Object 2, maintenance, monthly payment, 64,000 KES. On these same dates, regular transfers to Kamau's account went through the bank. The numbers matched down to the last coin. Object 2 was that very warehouse where people were held. No donors, no aid programs explained these payments. Now there was no doubt that it was a system with a precise internal structure. Objects, beneficiaries, couriers, reports. Everything. Like in business, only the goods were human destinies. In order for the document to acquire legal force, investigators appointed a handwriting examination. For this, samples of Wandera's signature and manuscripts, which he left in official Foundation reports, were seized. The comparison was carried out in a laboratory at the National Forensics Service. Experts worked for 2 days, and on the evening of the third, they issued a conclusion. The handwriting in the found notebooks completely matches the handwriting of Patrick Wandera. This meant that he personally kept the black accounts, distributing the money that went to the warehouse's maintenance and Kamau's payment. Any line of defense his lawyers had counted on collapsed. All testimonies about misunderstanding and mistake no longer made sense. From this moment, the investigation officially recognized the head of the Foundation not only knew about everything that was happening, but also personally controlled the operations, managing them as a systematic business. His bright reputation disappeared overnight, revealing a true structure beneath: cold, precise, built on deception and human suffering, transformed into numbers. Now the investigation was entering its final phase. Ahead was the court, which was not just to determine punishment, but to put a legal end to a case that had become one of the most high-profile in the country's history. When the investigation decided to return to Wandera's interrogation, a special silence, characteristic of something conclusive, already reigned in the department. Everyone understood. Ahead was not just another procedure, not a formal protocol, but a moment when a man who had built an illusion of a philanthropist and public figure around himself for many years would have to face for the first time everything he had built. This interrogation was meticulously prepared. Every page was checked, Kamau's testimonies were double-checked, and a logical chain with no gaps was compiled. When Vandera was brought into the office, he looked composed, though tired. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt ironed. Everything as if he had come to a meeting, not to a rendezvous with those who were about to destroy his reputation. His gaze still held the same cold politeness that had always distinguished his public appearances. He greeted the duty officer, nodded to the investigator, and, sitting down, asked if he could have some water. His voice sounded calm, almost mundane, as if he were talking about something insignificant. The investigator opened a folder, briefly reminded Vandera of his previous testimonies and the discovered accounting records, and, without further ado, placed an old, worn folder on the table. The papers were slightly frayed at the edges. Some pages were handwritten, others bore old fingerprints, creases, and ink stains. It looked not just like evidence, but like a living testament to a life lived in the shadows. Vandera looked at it, not immediately understanding what he was seeing. Nothing flickered in his face. Only his eyes narrowed slightly, as if his brain was quickly trying to find something to say. He flipped through a couple of pages, and for a moment, something very human, bewilderment, broke through in him. His fingers trembled, and his hand involuntarily wiped sweat from his forehead. Then he exhaled and quietly said, "These are not my records. Kamau kept these notebooks. He blackmailed me." This version sounded almost convincing. For a few seconds, even the investigator allowed it to hang in the air, to give Vandera a chance to believe there was still a way out. But then he pulled out a second folder, newer, with the Foundation's logo. It contained correspondence with foreign donors, dozens of letters, requests for help, reports, AGANZS, photo reports of rescued people, and all of them bore his signature. "Here you write that the Foundation provides food and housing for 500 children, the investigator said calmly. "Here, that new beds, clothes, and medicines have been purchased. The amounts you requested match the transfers to Kamau's account, to the penny." He spoke without threat, evenly, almost businesslike, and precisely because of this, every word sounded heavier than a shout. Vandera sat silently, his face paled, tension appeared on his cheekbones. At one point, he tried to smile, but the smile was strained and unnatural. "You don't understand," he finally said, looking away. "It's not what it seems. We were just reallocating funds." "Then explain," the investigator replied. "Why were these funds withdrawn in cash and given personally to Kamau?" The pause lasted indefinitely. Vandera clenched his hands on his knees, and for the first time throughout the investigation, he stopped looking his interlocutor in the eye. He was silent, then exhaled heavily and lowered his head. "I will not answer any more questions," he finally uttered. "I demand a lawyer." This phrase was spoken almost in a whisper, but in the room, it echoed like a verdict. The investigator nodded, made a note in the protocol, and closed the folder. That was it. From this moment on, he was no longer a person with whom one could bargain or play with words. His own documents, his own letters, and signatures had turned him into a prisoner within his own system of coordinates. On the day Vandera was led out of the interrogation room, the corridor was empty. Only the dim light from the windows and the faint sound of footsteps on the tiles. He walked without raising his head, and for the first time, he looked not like a man who managed funds and teams, but like someone from whom even the ability to explain himself had been taken. The door closed behind him, and from that moment, the investigation definitively moved from the realm of conjecture to the zone of proven facts. All that remained was the preparation of materials for the court, but the atmosphere in the department remained heavy. Investigators understood that this case was not just about crime and punishment. It was about faith in people, about trust that was used against the most vulnerable. And perhaps that is why the silence after the interrogation felt almost like mourning, not for a person, but for the illusion that he had destroyed with his own hands. When the investigators finally gathered all the testimonies, documents, expert reports, and photographs, a terrible but utterly logical system emerged before them. Not chaos, not spontaneous evil, not a fit of madness, but a well-thought-out, multi-layered scheme that had existed for years. Every element in it had its place. Every action was subject to the cold arithmetic of profit. What looked like a humanitarian mission to society was, in fact, a factory where human life was reduced to a budget line and compassion to an instrument of deception. From Kamau's testimony and the found documents, the sequence of actions was reconstructed. It all started on the streets, those places where no one asks questions, where faces disappear without a trace because there is no one to look for them. People were picked up under the pretext of help, promised food, shelter, participation in foundation programs. This was called Phase 1, recruitment. Everything happened on the outskirts, in disadvantaged areas, where patrols rarely appeared and indifference became part of the landscape. Then, transportation. People were delivered to the so-called Object 2. In documents, it was referred to as a temporary shelter, but in reality, it was an isolated underground complex with a network of narrow corridors where one could not go outside without a key. The premises were primitively equipped, without furniture, without windows. There they lived for months, and sometimes years, having no idea what was happening above ground. In the foundation system, this was called Stage 2, placement. On paper, everything looked humane. In life, silently and cruelly. Next began the economic calculation. Maintaining these people cost minimally. A little food, water, rare supplies of clothes and medicines. All of this was purchased with cash, without receipts or reports. The main thing was to maintain the appearance of life, so that during inspections or photo reports, everything looked plausible. This was Stage 3, maintenance. In essence, they were not required to be helped, but to maintain their existence in a minimal form so that the foundation could continue to receive funding. Stage 4, reporting. Perhaps the most cynical part of the scheme. Kamau told how several times a year, people with cameras would come. They filmed short videos, took photographs, and recorded phrases about hope for the future. From these frames, presentations for donors were then assembled. In some cases, old footage was used of the same people, but in different clothes, as if they were new beneficiaries. These videos and photographs became the product, what charitable organizations from Europe and the United States paid money for. The fifth and final stage, implementation. After the reports were sent, new tranches arrived in the foundation's accounts. The money was cashed out, part went to formal expenses, part to Kamau and other perpetrators. Everything was distributed with percentage accuracy. In the Foundation's public reports, each transaction was described as the purchase of school supplies, construction, treatment. No auditor could guess that behind these lines were real people, locked in underground premises, forgotten and invisible. According to the investigation's calculations, the scheme had existed without failures for almost 18 years. The first traces lead back to 2005, when the Foundation only began its activities. The last operations are dated 2021. During this time, according to preliminary estimates, more than 500 people passed through the system. Many of them are still unidentified, names that are not listed in any database. For the Foundation, these were just numbers, statistics, reporting. For the investigators, evidence that the scale of the crime went far beyond one country. And all of this was built for one thing. Money, not faith, not ideology, not madness, only profit. Every step, every action, every lie, everything had economic meaning. This was the main horror of the case. It was not irrational, it was calculated. Investigators, summarizing the results, wrote a dry formulation in the report. Motive, greed. The system was created to extract profit under the guise of humanitarian activities. But behind this phrase lay something more. It was a crime not against the law, but against the very idea of mercy. And perhaps that is why silence reigned in the hall, where the results of the investigation were discussed. No one spoke aloud, but everyone understood. In this story, there was no room for either accident or doubt. Only cold calculation, stretched out for almost 2 decades. The day everyone had waited for almost 3 years, arrived. The investigation was complete, the examinations confirmed, the materials compiled into dozens of volumes, and now everything was to pass into the hands of the court. At dawn, journalists were already standing outside the district court building, although the process was closed. They were not allowed inside, but everyone knew that this session was historic. It was too high profile a case. It had hung in the air for too long. People awaited the denouement, even if they were only allowed to see its shadow. The first session began without fanfare, quietly. The hall was small, windows curtained, cameras turned off. On the tables were folders marked "Strictly Confidential." The judge, prosecutors, lawyers, a few members of the press with limited access, and that was all. Even the names of some witnesses had been changed in the protocols. The process was officially declared closed. Among the victims were minors. The state had to protect them even after the truth became known. When the secretary read out the formulation, the case of abuse of trust in charitable activities and exploitation of persons under the care of the Hope of Africa Foundation, silence hung in the hall. Behind this name lay not just a crime, it was a systemic fraud that had stretched over almost 2 decades, where humanism was a signboard and greed was the foundation. The prosecutor read out 3 main charges: creating and leading an organized criminal group, abduction and unlawful detention of people, large-scale fraud involving mercenary exploitation. Each of these articles carried weight, but together they formed what lawyers call a combination of crimes of exceptional severity. The court first heard the perpetrator, Joseph Kamau. He was brought into the hall under guard. Throughout the process, he did not raise his head, did not look at the judge, did not try to justify himself. His confession, given during the investigation, became one of the key elements of the accusation. And that is why the court took into account his active cooperation with the investigation. The prosecutor read the verdict: 25 years of imprisonment with subsequent restriction of the right to hold positions related to work in social structures. This decision sounded dry, but everyone in the room understood that for Kamau, this was virtually the end of his life at liberty. He received the minimum possible sentence for such charges only because he gave the investigation what the case might have stalled without. His deal saved not himself, but the truth. When the verdict was read, Vandera sat motionless. Not a single muscle on his face twitched. He did not turn towards Kamau, did not allow himself either contempt or pity. Only his clasped fingers, white from tension. He awaited his turn. A few minutes later, his moment arrived. The judge turned the page, read the surname, and began to read the decision, which, in essence, had long been predetermined. The head of the Hope of Africa Foundation was found guilty on all counts. His signature was on falsified reports. His personal orders appeared in money transfer schemes. His handwriting was confirmed by expert examinations. Everything he denied now existed in the case materials as irrefutable facts. The prosecutor uttered a phrase that always sounds heavy, even for the most experienced lawyers. Organizer of a criminal group that operated for a long time with particular cruelty and abuse of official position. These words seemed to pierce the hall. Everything that once seemed like a humanitarian project now definitively became a crime beyond justification. The verdict was announced without a pause, almost routinely. Life imprisonment with a sentence served in a high-security penal colony. The judge read the formula to the end and put the papers aside. Vandera did not get up. He sat, staring at a single point, as if he already knew everything beforehand. No exclamations, no attempt to dispute, only silence and the slight rustle of pages as the secretary processed the documents. With this decision, a point was put not only in a legal sense. The court completed what began almost 20 years ago in basements, where care was promised, but suffering was delivered. Now, the truth had the form of a verdict, the judge's signature, and the seal of the state. When the session ended, no one applauded, no one spoke. The judge left first, followed by the prosecutor. Only chairs remained in the hall, cold air, and a sense of immense emptiness, as if justice had been served, but along with it, something human, something irreplaceable, had departed. And although this was the end of the court case, for the investigators, the story did not end. In the archives, dozens of unconfirmed names remained, traces in old photographs, faces no one could identify. The next investigation was to begin with them. After the court rendered its verdict, a rare moment for such cases ensued: silence. Not from relief, not from a sense of completion, but from the fact that the most difficult task lay ahead: bringing people back to life. Investigators, psychologists, doctors, and social service representatives began what would later be called the rehabilitation phase. This was not just a postscript, It was a real struggle for the fates of those who had endured what they now tried to speak of, only in whispers. In the first weeks after the trial, they worked around the clock. They compiled lists, checked documents, searched for relatives. Many names appeared in the archives with the notation, unidentified. Some had no family left at all. Some had left the country. Some had been declared missing 10 years ago. After several months, almost 200 people were identified and confirmed. 189 people were reunited with their families. It seemed like a miracle, considering how many years they had been isolated from the world. The rest came under state care, in new shelters created under the control of the Ministry of Social Protection. There they were provided with medical and psychological assistance, and most importantly, the opportunity to start over, even from scratch. The warehouse where it all began did not become a museum or a memorial. By decision of the mayor's office, it was demolished. The underground corridors, ventilation shafts, remnants of metal doors, all of it was filled in and concreted over. The city authorities explained it simply. Some places should not remain on the map. People who lived nearby said that after the demolition, the smell of dampness lingered for a long time, as if the earth itself was trying to get rid of the memory. A small park was later laid out on the site of the former complex, without plaques, without explanations. Only trees, young, thin, but alive. Meanwhile, the Kenyan government reacted quickly and harshly. Almost immediately after the verdict was pronounced, a special commission was established to audit all charitable foundations operating in the country. This audit was called Transparency 21. It included lawyers, auditors, representatives of public organizations, and international observers. At that time, more than 600 charitable foundations were officially operating in Kenya, and serious violations were found in 30 of them in the very first weeks. Several organizations had their licenses revoked, some had their accounts frozen. In parallel, the government changed the rules for international financing. Now, every foreign grant had to go through a multi-stage audit system. All transfers, even the smallest, were now recorded. Donors pledged to send inspectors personally, rather than relying on reports. Foundations, in turn, were required to provide not only financial statements, but also photo documentation of real projects, certified by independent structures. These measures could not bring back the past, but they became the first step towards ensuring that such a system could no longer exist in the shadows. When the investigators signed the final documents, the case officially received the designation closed. It was known as Children Under Nairobi. Behind these words lay not just a story of crime, but a mirror of society, its blindness, credulity, and faith in benevolent facades. This case showed that evil can appear respectable, wear a tie, smile from a podium, receive awards for humanitarianism. But even after the trial, after reforms and checks, a feeling of incompleteness remained. In one of the final reports, the investigator wrote a short phrase: "The existence of similar structures in other regions cannot be ruled out." It was not supported by evidence, but it was not removed from the text. Because everyone understood, if such a system could exist for almost 20 years and receive millions of dollars from good hands, then perhaps it was not the only one. The story of the Hope of Africa Foundation ended with a verdict, but the trace it left continues to live, in new laws, in documents, in human memory. And yet, the most important thing it showed is that crime can stand in the middle of the street for years, smiling at passersby, and no one will notice. This means that the main lesson this story taught is to look more closely. Because, as it turned out, the darkest things often hide not in basements, but under the guise of good.